Welcome back. Time for another episode of Turn Talk. It's been brought to my attention that many new turners aren't aware of proper, I'm not going to say chucking techniques, but proper tenon length or mortise depths when it comes to scroll chucks. It's not a fault of yours, and this subject has been covered many times by the likes, in fact, of Sam Angelo, the Wyoming wood turner, Carl Jacobson, Mike Walt, probably even Sean Graham of Worth the Effort. Most of these guys you've already watched, but it bears repeating. A lot of those older videos, a lot of new turners won't necessarily go back and look at. It's not because, well, you just don't have time. There's so many turning videos out there. So I was asked to bring this point up. Now, when looking at a scroll chuck, there's only one truly machined surface on this chuck, and that's the top of the jaws. This surface right here. This inside surface down here is not machined, even though it looks it. It's not machined to a particular depth or standard. Neither is this shoulder. So when you're turning a tenon on a piece of wood, how long do you make it? Well, that length is important. These are dovetail jaws, which is what most of us prefer because they grip better. They're dovetailed on the outside for a dovetail mortise, and there's a little step inside which helps hold the wood even better. But how deep or how long you make your tenon is important. You never want to bottom your tenon out in this chuck, ever. Because, again, these are not machined flat. This is machined flat. This shoulder should contact the bottom of your piece. And I'll demonstrate this in a little bit. But this shoulder should contact the bottom of your piece. This is what will ensure that your piece stays square on the lathe while it's in the chuck. By the same token, if you're doing a mortise, you don't want a mortise that is so deep that your piece rests on this part of the chuck, because it's just not machined to be perfect. This is what you want in the bottom of your mortise. So you want your mortise to be shallower than this length right here. These things are important. And that brings up another question. What's better, a mortise or a tenon, or a spigot as some people call it? The simple yet often frustrating answer is it depends. It depends on a couple of things. It depends on, first, what's best for you. What do you find works best for you? For me, it depends on a couple of things, and that is one of the major ones is grain direction, and also the wood density or strength, if you will. I use both, but which one I use depends on the wood that I'm turning and the grain orientation. This is the tree. The grain runs this way. All wood is strongest in this direction because they have to withstand a lot of force because of the wind and whatnot. So the tree's strength, the wood strength, is in the direction of the grain. Always. Wood is stronger this way than it is this way. Let me show you what I mean. This 2x4, for example, was cut out of a tree. The tree grew like this. This wood is stronger this way than it is this way. And if you look at the grain and the direction of the grain, running this way with the fibers are this way, and you've got the growth rings like this. What that means is in softer woods like this pine, cypress, other soft woods, cedar, this grain, if you try to split it, it's going to split easier this way than if you were to try to split it this way, cross grain. You can't take a log, lay it on its side, start a cut with an axe, put a wedge in it and split it. It doesn't work. You turn it this way, it'll split. That's because the grain, the strength of the tree is weaker this way than it is this way, or this way. Now, that said, if I'm turning a soft piece of wood like pine or maple, or if I'm using it, pine or maple, if I'm turning a soft piece of wood like pine or cypress or cedar, or I'm using one of those for a glue block, which I don't do often, it depends again on the grain orientation. If I'm going to turn one of these softer pieces, I will always use a tenon if I'm doing end grain. So if I'm like spindle work, then I will use a tenon and not a mortise, because it will split this way if you use a mortise. If you use a tenon, you're compressing on those fibers, and that's where they're strongest. If you were to turn it this way and try to do it as a faceplate, I would use a mortise here rather than a tenon, because the tenon will split or split off or break off a whole lot easier than you'll blow it out with a mortise. But you can do that too if you're not careful, and if the surroundings of the mortise aren't wide enough. You need a substantial piece of wood. I mean, you need substantial thickness around that mortise if you're gonna use a mortise in softer woods. One exception to the end grain thing is with really dense woods like oak or mesquite. These two pieces of oak, for example, this is live oak and this is a red oak. This is cross grain, and I have a tenon, which I can't get by with on pine. You've seen that happen to me in a couple of videos, or with cypress or pine. I've had cypress fail. When I was working on the river bowl, I had the pine tenon failed before I even got started. This piece of oak is also side grain, and I've got a tenon, because the fibers and the tree and the wood is strong enough to withstand a tenon. A mortise will work just as well in either one of these two pieces of oak. So that's when the answer becomes, well, what's best for you? What works best for you? Typically, when you're doing end grain, it's always better to use a tenon, regardless of the wood species, just because it's so much stronger. And that bit of discussion brings us to another point that I get sometimes asked, but it's not mentioned or asked often enough, and that's how long does my tenon need to be, or how deep does my mortise need to be? And we talked about that a little bit at the beginning when I was telling you that you don't want to run this to the bottom of the chuck. Let's go to the lathe and let's talk about this a little more. This is a live oak box that I was working on. I showed you this a minute ago. I've got a tenon on this end. I had a mortise on the bottom. It failed. As you can tell, as you can see here where it blew out on this side when I was hollowing it, I got a catch. And when I got that catch, it blew this grain out. Well, if this is side grain, which it is, because this is the end grain here. If this is side grain, why did that blow out? Mainly because what I had, if you can tell from the size of this compared to my chuck, looking at this compared to the chuck, I didn't have much meat on the outside of that mortise. It just wasn't enough for this to be it just wasn't enough for this to withstand the side pressures that the chuck was putting on. This particular part of the grain happened to be just a little bit weak. So I'm going to have to reshape this and finish it up. And what I'll probably end up doing is making this, fixing this, making it flat, and using a glue block We haven't talked about glue blocks. And we haven't talked about glue blocks because that wasn't really part of this. But I know turners, for example, Lyle Jameson, he will never, he doesn't use chucks. He doesn't. I don't know if he even owns them. But he won't use a chuck. He will always use a glue block. That's his preference. And it works well for him. Glue blocks have been around, and the way wood turners have turned for decades before the scroll jaw chuck came out. Now let's get you up here so you can see while we answer this question. All right. So talking about size, the way these chucks are designed, when you're between 3/32 and a 1/16 of an inch gap is when this is the most round, and that's where you will have the most strength. These were originally one piece. They were cut apart, and what's missing in between them is the kerf that whatever cut these apart took. And if you look at this really closely, you can tell that is not a perfect circle. But if you open it up to about right there, it is a perfect circle. And that is where this chuck is at its strongest, when this is a perfect circle. Otherwise, if I was to try to, and this chuck might very well open up wide enough to fit this, but if it does, okay, that's as wide as it opens. So look at that. If my tenon is just under that size, where are my points of contact going to be on the wood? If I've got a round tenon in here, what's going to contact the wood? This point, this point, this point, this point. So you'll have 8 sharp points in contact with the wood. That's all. This part of the chuck jaw isn't used at all because that round circle won't fill that, because that's not a round circle. For maximum strength, you want a circle. Now, what part of the circle is touching the jaws? All of it, except for where those little gaps are. So that's, you get a lot more strength this way than you do if it's out. So that's how big your mortise should be. I mean, your tenon should be. This tenon, truthfully, is just a little too big for this. Not by much, but just a little. By the same token, what size should your mortise be? Whatever gives you the closest to being a full circle, so that this, every bit of this jaw is in contact with the inside of the mortise. Again, if you have it, if you cut your mortise so big that you have to run your jaws out, that's not a perfect circle. And the only portion of this chuck jaw that's going to be touching in a bigger circle is these 4 points right there. That's not as much strength as if it's grabbing all the way around. Okay, I've got this inserted in the chuck, and look in here. The bottom of this tenon does not go to the bottom of the inside of those jaws. I've got about 1/8 of an inch gap between the bottom of the chuck and the bottom of the tenon, and that's what you want. Maybe even a 1/16, that's up to you, but you really don't need super long tenons to make this work and to make it strong enough and make it safe. You can in fact get by with a tenon just a little bit shorter than that if you're trying to save wood. The same thing goes for the mortise. You don't want the mortise so deep that this doesn't reach the bottom of the mortise. That would put the mortise, the piece resting on these, and that is not the machined surface. It may come close, but these weren't machined to that specification. This part of the jaw is the only part of the jaw that was machined to that spec. So that's what needs to be in contact. Not the shoulder of this, but the tip of the jaw, the front of the jaw itself, not the shoulder. The front of the jaw needs to rest on the shoulder of the piece. You don't want to bottom the piece out on the chuck, either inside or outside. I was going to demonstrate how weak using soft wood and a mortise was using this piece of pine. Well, I didn't quite get the mortise cut. I wasn't quite finished, and I just had it between centers and it came apart. There's no obvious sign of cracking there that has been cracked or for a long time because it's fresh looking wood. There wasn't a crack in it when I started, but it was just that weak. That's why you don't want to mortise in side grain on softer woods, because they just can't withstand the pressures. So thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Hopefully I've answered some questions, cleared up some things. There are others out there who have done a much better job of covering this topic than I could begin to. Just my 2 cents in it and a quick refresher on the how-tos. Hopefully it'll help some of the newer turners. So appreciate it again. Y'all come back.